$10, the stranger said, his voice as dry as the dust that coated his coat. The crowd turned, eyes narrowing. No one had paid that much for a soul in Coyote's reach in years. Dust drifted lazily across the street, swirling in uneven patterns, as if the earth itself was too tired to remember its history. The sun, low and unforgiving in the sky, painted everything with a burnt orange hue, casting long shadows where life had once been abundant. Harlan Graves sat tall in his saddle, his coat worn and heavy with the dust of the trail. His horse limped, favoring its back leg, tired from the long journey. He didn't hurry, not for the town, not for the people waiting. He was used to time passing slowly. He'd learned that patience was a thing you earned, not one you practiced. The town stretched out in front of him like a ghost, its bones picked clean by time. It had seen too much, and now it was waiting to be forgotten. A few rusted signs clattered on their hinges as he passed, their old words barely visible beneath the grime. The boardwalk creaked underfoot, as if protesting the disturbance, and a tin cup rolled across the dry planks like it had some place to be, though it seemed lost in its aimless journey. The town square, where men and women used to barter goods and tell tales of old days, was now the site of an auction, a transaction of a different sort. Harlan's eyes narrowed as he saw the gathering crowd, their faces set with anticipation. He had no use for auctions, for the cheap trade of people and things. But there was something here that drew him in. Something, or rather someone, whose presence stirred memories of his own loss, his own brokenness. A woman stood on the auction block, bound at the wrists with fraying hemp, her gaze sweeping over the crowd without blinking. She didn't flinch as the men's eyes raked over her, their judgment obvious even in the way they adjusted their hats and shifted their weight on the dusty ground. Her dress was torn at the hem, her boots caked with mud, her hair, the color of dry straw, curled wildly around her face, strands sticking to her mouth in the wind. There was nothing in her expression, no fear, no pleading, only an emptiness that made her look older than she was. Harlan didn't know why he had stopped. Perhaps it was the way the crowd parted when she stepped forward, as though she wasn't really there. Maybe it was the hollow look in her eyes, something that mirrored his own. He had been a widower for 3 winters, and every day since then, the world had seemed more empty, more distant. His wife had died in his arms, blood soaking into the snow beneath them, her last breath warm against his face. The years since had been a blur of silence and solitude, and nothing seemed to have meaning beyond the daily struggle to survive. But when he looked at her, at the girl, no more than 21, who stood so still it was like something inside him stirred, something forgotten, buried deep. The auctioneer's voice broke through his thoughts, rising above the wind, offering her as though she were any other commodity. The town needed strong hands, he said, strong backs and quiet mouths. Labor was scarce, and she could be had for a mere $6 for a season's work. Harlan's hand tightened around the reins. He didn't need to look at the men around him to know what they were thinking. They were hungry for anything that could still be traded, whether flesh or labor. There were no real laws in places like this, just the law of the land and the law of those who could hold power. This girl, this woman, was just another piece of currency in a town that had been starving for too long. A man near the back called out $5. Another, round-faced and red-eyed, offered $6 in cider. The crowd chuckled, the laughter low and dark, tinged with something ugly beneath it. Harlan remained unmoving, his eyes fixed on the girl. Her gaze, too, met his. It wasn't hope, nor was it pleading. It was something else entirely: recognition. She saw something in him that no one else had. The auctioneer called again, his voice rising, pushing the price higher, a frantic need in his tone, as if desperate for the transaction to go through. $6, everyone swatting twice. 10. Harlan's voice cut through the air, low but firm. The crowd froze. Somewhere, a tin cup fell to the ground, rolling once before coming to a stop. The auctioneer's mouth opened, but the next words were drowned by the sudden roar of the wind. The crowd fell silent. A ripple ran through the gathering, as if they couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened. The auctioneer blinked, his voice faltering before he recovered. 10, he repeated, as though the word itself was foreign. 10, Harlan confirmed, pulling a crumpled bill from his coat pocket and laying it on the counter. The rifle at his side, a silent reminder of his past. His hand moved slowly, careful, deliberate, as though he were handling something fragile, something he had carried too far and could no longer ignore. $10, the auctioneer mumbled, still uncertain. A rifle. Good shape, Harlan added, sliding the weapon onto the counter beside the money. She comes with me now. The crowd parted without a word, not out of respect, but out of confusion. Harlan stepped forward, his boots crunching in the dust, moving past the men who looked at him with something akin to surprise. They knew him Harlan Graves, the widower from Devil's Ridge, a man who hadn't spoken at a town meeting in 5 years, whose wife had bled out in his arms while he screamed at God, furious with the injustice of it all. He stopped in front of her, his eyes scanning her face now that they were closer. Beneath the grime, he could see the pale, freckled skin of someone who had been living too long in the shadows. Her lips were cracked, her wrists raw where the rope had dug in, but it was her eyes gray like the bottom of a storm that caught his attention. She didn't flinch when he stepped closer, didn't look away. She stood still, hollow, as if she had already given up on the world and now only moved through it as a shadow. "I ain't broken," she said flatly, the words hanging in the air between them. "I know," Harlan answered, his voice rough, not from bitterness but from something deeper, a recognition that went beyond words. He reached for the rope around her wrists. She flinched instinctively, then held still as he loosened it, his fingers brushing her skin with surprising tenderness. The rope fell away, leaving angry red lines behind. She rubbed at them absently, but didn't offer a word of thanks. She didn't need to. Harlan didn't offer his hand. He simply turned and walked, his steps slow, measured. He didn't need to look behind him to know that she was following. She had no other choice. Someone muttered behind him, a voice barely above a whisper. Don't know which one's more ghost and human. Harlan didn't respond. The words meant nothing to him. The wind howled in his ears, and the town, that forsaken place, slowly fell behind them. The sun dipped lower in the sky as they rode out, the long shadows stretching behind them like the ghosts of things that had passed. It wasn't until they reached the tree line that she spoke again. Her voice was quiet, almost lost to the wind. "I'm Anna." "Harlan," he said, though he hadn't asked. The name seemed to hang there, a formality. Nothing more. "You gonna use me like the others?" she asked. Her gaze fixed on the road ahead, her voice thick with suspicion. "No," he answered. His tone was flat, the words simple, and it felt like a promise. Anna didn't respond. But he felt her presence behind him as they rode into the night, the world stretching out before them like an uncertain path. The wind blew in their faces, the town and the auction fading behind them. Harlan didn't know what would come next, but he knew that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. The road ahead was long, and it was unclear where it would lead. But as the darkness fell around them, something deep and ancient stirred in Harlan's chest. It was the beginning of something neither of them could name yet. And outside, the night stretched long, filled with the cold, quiet promise of the unknown. As Anna gets up to leave, Harlan's voice stops her. "Where are you going?" She doesn't turn around as she whispers, "I don't belong here." The wind on the trail felt like a razor's edge against the skin, sharp and unforgiving, much like the path Harlan had just set Anna on. The horses' hooves drummed a steady rhythm against the cracked earth, their breath fogging the cool air as the last traces of daylight began to slip away over the horizon. The land around them was stark rolling hills, sparse trees, and rocky outcrops that seemed to loom like silent sentinels watching them pass. The fading light of the late afternoon stretched long shadows across the earth, and the air grew colder as the sun sank lower. The journey was slow, deliberate, too slow. Somewhere behind them, a horse snorted, a sound out of place on the empty trail. Harlan's grip on the reins tightened. "Keep riding," he murmured, though he didn't look back. Anna rode slightly behind Harlan, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed ahead, though her mind seemed far away. She hadn't said much since the auction, not that she needed to. She had learned too much, too fast. Life had aged her beyond her 21 years. The rope still burned at her wrists, a reminder of how quickly her life had changed, how easily she had become a commodity in the eyes of others. But this was different. She could feel it, for the first time in a long while. She didn't feel like a thing to be sold. She wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or frightened by the difference. Harlan, this man she had only just met, was giving her something she hadn't had in a long time space. He didn't push her to speak. He didn't look at her as if she were something broken. She wasn't sure if that was kindness or if he was simply too distant to care. It made it harder to trust, harder to figure out where she stood. The horse beneath her, a bay mare with a limp, moved at a slow, methodical pace, matching Harlan's steadiness. Her boots, still covered in mud from the auction, pressed against the sides of the horse as they continued on the trail. The rhythmic motion of the ride, the steady creak of leather saddles, and the quiet of the land felt strangely familiar, like something buried deep within her. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was there, a flicker of something warm, maybe even safe. She had been running from that warmth for as long as she could remember, but it was here now, slowly creeping up on her, like the fading light. Harlan's figure ahead of her was silent and still, his long coat swaying gently as the wind tugged at it. He didn't seem to notice her hesitation. She couldn't decide whether that bothered her or gave her comfort. He wasn't like the others, the men who had looked at her with hunger, with a transactional gaze that made her feel as if she were no more than a possession, something to be used, and then discarded. Harlan didn't look at her like that. He looked through her, maybe even past her, in a way that was both unsettling and reassuring, after what felt like hours. Harlan pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of a small creek, its water flowing over rocks with a soft, steady sound that filled the silence between them. He dismounted with practiced ease, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Anna hesitated for a moment before following his lead, swinging her leg over the horse's back and stepping down. Her legs ached from the long ride, but it was nothing compared to the weight that had been pressing on her chest since the auction. Harlan walked toward the creek, kneeling at the water's edge and splashing some into his hands, cupping them together to drink. Anna stood a few paces behind him, her eyes scanning the land around them. She could feel the unease creeping back, the way her past always lingered at the edges of her thoughts, waiting for the moment it would catch up with her. "Do you ever stop?" she asked suddenly, her voice rough from disuse. Harlan paused, his hand still at the water's edge. For a moment, he didn't answer, as if the question had caught him off guard. He stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers before turning to face her. His eyes were distant, like he was trying to decide whether to let her in or leave her out in the cold. "Stop what?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Stop running," she said, her gaze fixed on the ground as she spoke, though her words were aimed at him. He didn't answer right away, but she could feel the weight of his silence pressing in on her. His eyes were on her now, like he was studying her, trying to figure out what made her tick. Maybe he was wondering if she was just another lost soul, another broken person in a world that had long since stopped caring. "I'm not running," he said after a long pause. "I've stopped running a long time ago." Anna didn't know what to say to that. He was right. She was still running, but she didn't know what she was running from anymore. The world had taught her to keep moving, to never stay still, to never let anyone see the cracks in her armor. But something about being here, with Harlan, made her wonder if maybe she didn't have to keep running forever. She shook her head and turned toward the creek, crouching down to scoop up a handful of water. She drank slowly, the cool liquid filling her mouth and momentarily washing away the dryness in her throat. The cold felt good, but it didn't reach the emptiness she felt inside. She could feel Harlan's gaze on her, but she didn't look up. Not yet. For a moment, they both stood in silence, the only sound the quiet gurgle of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then Harlan spoke again. "You don't have to talk about it," he said. "I don't need to know your past." Anna's gaze flickered toward him, but she didn't say anything. She wasn't sure if he was offering her some sort of solace, or if he was just trying to push her into something she wasn't ready for. But there was something in his words, something steady, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't like the others. "I'm not asking you to tell me," he continued, his voice soft but firm. "But I'm not going anywhere." His words hung in the air between them, a promise she wasn't sure she could believe. She had been left behind before, left to fend for herself when the world decided she wasn't worth saving. She had learned to trust no one, to depend on no one. But something in Harlan's voice, in the quiet certainty of his presence, made her wonder if maybe that had been a mistake. "I don't belong here," she whispered, almost to herself. Harlan didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, as though he understood the weight of her words. "You don't have to belong anywhere," he said. "You just have to be." For the first time since they'd met, Anna felt a shift inside her, a small, almost imperceptible change. She didn't know if she was ready to trust him, but she also didn't feel like she needed to run anymore. Not tonight. Not here. With him. They sat for a while longer, the sun finally dipping below the horizon, leaving only the faintest glow in the sky. Harlan stood first, stretching his long legs and offering her a hand up. Anna took it, hesitating for a moment before allowing herself to be pulled to her feet. The road ahead was dark, but it no longer felt as uncertain. not with Harlan by her side. As they prepared to leave, Anna turned her face toward the wind, her eyes closing for a moment as if to gather herself. Then she opened them again, meeting Harlan's gaze. "You ever think about the past?" she asked quietly. "All the time," he answered. "But I don't carry it with me anymore." Anna nodded, unsure of what to say next. She wasn't sure if she could do the same, but it was something to think about. They mounted their horses and rode on, the trail ahead stretching into the darkness. The night was silent, the world wrapped in a stillness that seemed to hold its breath. And as the land opened up before them, Anna couldn't help but wonder what the future would bring. As they reached the edge of the forest, Anna pulled her horse to a stop, her eyes scanning the horizon. A figure on horseback appeared in the distance, silhouetted against the setting sun. Harlan's grip tightened on the reins. "Stay close," he murmured, his eyes locked on the approaching rider. The figure slowed, just for a heartbeat, and then spurred the horse straight at them. Harlan stopped at the cabin door, his hand hovering over the handle. Inside, something creaked too heavy for the wind. He glanced at Anna. "Stay behind me." The low glow of the fire barely cut through the shadows that clung to the corners of the room, its crackling heat offering only a fleeting respite from the oppressive stillness that seemed to settle over everything. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, rattling the window panes and sending wisps of snow swirling against the cabin's thin walls. It was the kind of night that made everything feel too small, too tight. Inside, Anna sat on the edge of the bed, her back straight, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to keep the cold out. Her eyes flickered to the hearth, but they didn't linger. Instead, they kept moving, darting over the room in the way of someone who wasn't used to stillness, someone who wasn't used to having the luxury of doing nothing. Her gaze finally settled on Harlan, who was sitting by the fire, his broad frame silhouetted against the dancing flames. He didn't look at her. Not yet. His hands were steady as he stoked the fire, feeding it small pieces of wood with deliberate care. Each motion was practiced, each breath a measured rhythm in the heavy air between them. He hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived at the cabin, and Anna hadn't either. They had eaten in silence, the only sound the scrape of forks against tin plates, the quiet hum of the wind outside, and the occasional crackle from the fire. It wasn't just the cold that made the silence unbearable. It was the weight of it, the weight of words that hadn't been said yet, the things left unspoken, the things neither of them could bring themselves to face. For Anna, the silence felt like a trap, a slow, creeping thing that would catch her in its grasp if she wasn't careful. But there was something in Harlan's silence, too, something steady and solid that didn't push, didn't demand. And somehow, that made it worse. Harlan had already told her that he wasn't asking her to speak, that he didn't need to know her past. But Anna couldn't shake the feeling that the more they sat in this quiet space, the more it became a wall between them. She hadn't run away from the past just to live in another silence. It was then that she realized she was afraid of this, afraid of the stillness, afraid of what it meant, afraid of what it might turn her into. She shifted on the bed, the rough wool blanket rustling under her, and Harlan finally turned his head, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since they had entered the cabin. His gaze was unreadable, distant, but there was something soft in it now, something that hadn't been there before. Anna wasn't sure what to make of it. The fire crackled again, the flames stretching and dancing, casting fleeting shadows across the room. Harlan didn't speak at first, But Anna felt the tension in the air, the weight of his presence in the quiet room. It seemed like he was waiting for her to say something, though she wasn't sure what. Finally, after a long stretch of silence, Harlan spoke. "You never told me why you were sold." Anna's heart skipped, and she tensed, her hands tightening around the blanket. The question, so simple and direct, felt like a trap. She could feel her body go cold. The walls she had carefully built around herself, the ones that kept everything contained, threatened to crack under the weight of his words. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze dropped to her hands, clenched tightly in her lap. She could feel the sting of old wounds beginning to surface, but she wouldn't let them out. Not here. Not now. "I don't want to talk about it," she muttered, her voice barely audible. Harlan didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. There was no anger in his eyes, no impatience, just an unspoken understanding. He was waiting for her to choose whether or not to speak, but he wouldn't push her. Not yet. For a long time, neither of them moved. The only sound in the room was the fire, the steady pop and crackle of the wood as it burned. Anna's mind raced, filled with images of her past, of the things she had done, the things that had been done to her. It felt like the weight of her entire life had led her to this moment, to this small, quiet room where nothing was as simple as it seemed. Harlan stood up then, slowly, as if weighing every movement. His boots scraped across the wooden floor as he walked toward the small table in the corner, where a half-empty bottle of whiskey sat beside 2 tin cups. He poured a small amount into each cup, the amber liquid catching the light from the fire. He turned toward her, holding out one of the cups. "Drink," he said, his voice low but firm. Anna hesitated. She wasn't sure what to make of the gesture. But there was something in the way he looked at her, something that told her he wasn't just offering her a drink. He was offering her something more, something she didn't know if she was ready to take. Slowly, she took the cup from his hand, her fingers brushing against his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She lifted the cup to her lips, the warmth of the whiskey filling her mouth, burning down her throat in a way that felt good, almost comforting. She took another sip, and then another, the liquor loosening the tightness in her chest. When she set the cup down, Harlan was still watching her. There was a softness to his gaze now, but it wasn't pity. It wasn't sympathy. It was understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the weight she carried. "I won't ask again," he said after a moment, "but if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." Anna didn't respond. She couldn't. There were too many words caught in her throat, too many things she couldn't say, things she didn't even know how to say. But in that moment, she felt something shift. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something fragile and delicate that might, over time, become more than just a quiet understanding. As the night stretched on, the fire burned low, the shadows growing longer in the corners of the cabin. Anna lay back on the bed, her body exhausted, but her mind restless. Harlan sat in the chair near the fire, his eyes staring into the flickering flames. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the night. The silence between them filled with the quiet weight of things unspoken, of things still waiting to be understood. It wasn't until the fire had nearly burned out that Anna closed her eyes, finally succumbing to the pull of sleep. But as she drifted off, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. And whether that change would be for better or worse, She didn't yet know. The next morning, as they prepared to leave the cabin, a shadow moved across the threshold, followed by a loud knock at the door. Harlan's hand instinctively reached for his rifle. "Stay inside," he muttered, his voice tense. The road stretched out before them like a promise, a distant, uncertain horizon. In the silence of the trail, where the only sounds were the steady rhythm of hooves against dirt, and the wind carrying the scent of pine and earth, everything felt possible. Yet, in the back of Harlan's mind, something darker lurked, something old, something familiar, telling him that no matter how far he went, the past would always find a way to catch up. The sky had been gray all morning, thick clouds hanging low over the land like a shroud, and the chill in the air only seemed to deepen as the day dragged on. The mountains in the distance loomed like jagged teeth, cutting into the sky, while the landscape around them stretched endlessly dusty plains dotted with stunted trees, scattered patches of snow that hadn't melted from the winter's last bite. Harlan's horse plodded along at a steady pace, its hooves kicking up small clouds of dust with every step. Anna rode slightly behind, her face turned away from the wind, but her eyes were wide, taking in the landscape. She was silent, as she had been for most of the journey, but Harlan could feel the weight of her gaze on him, the way she seemed to be studying him in the corners of his vision. It didn't make him uncomfortable, not exactly, but it made the silence feel more strained, more uncertain. He hadn't expected it to be like this. The quiet that followed after buying her had been easy at first, just the two of them, moving through the world like ghosts. But now, with every mile they put behind them, there was a growing tension between them, something unsaid, a weight that neither of them seemed willing to confront, even though it hung between them like a thick fog. Anna had said nothing since they left the cabin. She hadn't asked where they were going, hadn't questioned him about his intentions. She simply followed, as though waiting for something to happen, as though waiting for him to tell her what to do next. He wasn't sure why she stayed, but part of him was grateful for it, though he couldn't say why. "Where are we headed?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking through the silence. Harlan glanced over his shoulder at her. Her face was as unreadable as ever, but there was something in her eyes now, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even a hint of hope. He had expected this question, had known it would come sooner or later, but it still caught him off guard. "I don't know," he said simply. "Just keep riding, and we'll find a place." It was the truth, in a way. He didn't know where they were headed. He had no plan, no destination in mind. He just needed to move forward, away from everything he had left behind. He needed to outrun the ghosts of his past, the memories of his wife's death that haunted him like a specter he couldn't shake. But Anna didn't seem to be waiting for answers from him. She didn't press him further. Instead, she nodded and turned her gaze back to the road ahead, as if accepting his answer without question. They rode in silence until Anna finally broke it. "You always this quiet?" Harlan didn't turn. "Most folks prefer it." "Maybe I don't." He almost smiled, but didn't answer. Hooves on the uneven earth and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The wind had picked up, and the air had grown colder as the day wore on. The trail wound through a sparse forest, trees gnarled and twisted by the harsh winds of the high plains, their branches bare, as though they had given up on ever being whole again. Harlan's eyes scanned the road ahead, his mind alert, though his body moved automatically, accustomed to the rhythm of travel. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts more than his thoughts. to listen to the land beneath his feet, the wind that carried the scent of trouble. They had been riding for hours when they came to a small creek, its water running clear and fast over the rocks. The horses slowed as they neared it, stepping carefully over the stones that lined the creek bed. Harlan dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth as he walked over to the water's edge. He looked down at the creek for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if lost in thought. Anna followed him, but her steps were slower now, as though she were hesitant, unsure of something. Harlan didn't look up when she stopped beside him, but he could feel the weight of her presence, feel her curiosity pressing in on him. "The creek runs cold in these parts," he said quietly, his voice carrying a strange weight. "But it's good water." Anna glanced at him, but didn't say anything in response. She crouched down beside him, her fingers brushing against the cold stones beneath the water's surface. She seemed to be lost in her own thoughts, just as he was. A branch snapped somewhere upriver. Harlan's eyes flicked toward the sound, but the water kept rushing as if nothing had happened. Harlan stood up and wiped his hands on his pants before turning back to the horses. As he moved, he heard Anna stand too, but she didn't follow him immediately. She lingered by the water, her face turned away, her gaze distant. "Are you running from something?" she asked suddenly, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it over the wind. The question hit Harlan like a punch to the gut, but he didn't flinch. He knew this was coming, knew that at some point she would want to know what he was hiding, what had led him here. He had been avoiding the question, not because he didn't want to answer, but because he wasn't sure he could. "I'm not running," he said, his voice steady, though it felt like he was lying to himself. "I'm just moving forward." Anna didn't respond, but her eyes flickered to him for a moment, and in that glance, he saw the same uncertainty that had been growing inside him. She was waiting for something, maybe for him to be honest, or maybe for her own reasons. But the truth was, neither of them was ready to face it. Not yet. He turned away then, heading back to the horses, his heart heavy with the weight of the unspoken words that hung between them. The path ahead seemed clearer now, but that only made the journey more difficult. There was no running from the past, not anymore. The land stretched before him, endless and empty, and yet the closer they got to the horizon, the more he felt trapped. Anna mounted her horse without a word and followed him, her movement slower than before, as though she were carrying something heavier than her body weight. The trail continued, winding through the land, but the road ahead felt less like a journey and more like a reckoning. They rode on through the afternoon, the sky darkening with every passing hour. The wind picked up again, biting at their faces, and the land around them seemed to grow more desolate. But Harlan didn't stop. He couldn't. There was no stopping. Not now. As they approached the base of the mountain pass, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, warning them of the storm to come. Anna slowed her horse and glanced up at the sky, but Harlan didn't stop. The rain had already begun to fall in heavy sheets, the sky turning black with the weight of the storm. "Come on," Harlan urged, pushing his horse forward. "We'll make it to shelter before nightfall." But as they pressed on, the storm grew worse, the wind picking up in violent gusts, and the path became increasingly treacherous. The ground beneath their horses' hooves turned to mud, and the rain fell harder, drenching them to the bone. Harlan gritted his teeth against the cold, his coat already soaked through, but he kept moving forward. Anna, now behind him, didn't complain. She simply followed, her silhouette fading in and out of the storm's mist. They had only ridden a few more miles when Harlan's instincts flared. He could feel the presence of someone, something nearby, another rider. Perhaps, without warning, he reached for his rifle, his hand instinctively brushing the stock. His gaze swept across the land, scanning the horizon, but he saw nothing. Only the rain, the thunder, the relentless storm. But then he heard a distant shout, followed by the sound of hooves pounding against the wet earth. The shout grew louder, and before Harlan could react, the silhouette of a rider appeared through the mist, their horse moving fast, approaching them at an alarming speed. Harlan's hand tightened around his rifle. "Stay close," he muttered under his breath. The morning after the storm's stillness. The kind of stillness that forces people to look inward, to face the thoughts they've been running from. The sky was clearing, the first rays of sunlight slicing through the damp clouds, painting the land in shades of gold and gray. The air was heavy, thick with the remnants of the night's downpour, and every breath seemed to carry the weight of the storm. But now, in the wake of the chaos, the world was quieter, almost too quiet. The ground, still soaked from the rain, was dark and slick, as if the earth itself were trying to hold on to the last remnants of the storm. Harlan stood at the edge of the small camp they'd set up during the night, his back turned to the morning sun. His rifle rested against a tree nearby, the remnants of the fire crackling faintly beside him. He hadn't slept much, though he hadn't bothered to keep track of the hours. It had been a long, restless night of thinking of trying to shake off the memories that seemed to creep up on him when he least expected it. The storm had driven him to a place of reflection, to a place he didn't like to visit. As Anna moved around the camp, packing away their few belongings, Harlan kept his back turned to her, not out of distrust, but because the silence between them had grown too heavy to ignore. There was a quiet tension in the air, one that neither of them spoke of, but both felt. It had been building since the night before, the moment when Anna had asked him about the past, about what he was running from. Harlan wasn't sure he could answer that question, not in a way that made sense. The past had always been there, lingering just out of sight, and no matter how many miles he put between himself and the memories, they followed him. His wife's face was still there, in the spaces between breaths, in the moments when the wind howled like it did back in Devil's Ridge. He could feel her absence, a constant ache that nothing could fill. But Anna, she was different. She had her own ghosts to carry, her own struggles to face. He could see the wariness in her eyes, the way she watched him with a mixture of caution and something else, something he couldn't name. She hadn't said much since they left the cabin, but Harlan knew the silence between them wasn't just about the storm. It was about something deeper, something they both kept buried under layers of guarded words and unspoken histories. "Morning," Anna's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to face her. She was standing a few feet away, her face barely illuminated by the soft light of the morning. She didn't smile, didn't offer any pleasantries. It wasn't that she was unfriendly. It was simply that she had learned to live without the need for small talk, without the need for anything that might tie her down. Her eyes, though, were steady, watching him with the kind of intensity that made him feel like she could see right through him. It was a look that unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. "Got the horses ready," she said, her voice steady. But there was something in her tone, something more than the words that made him pause. Harlan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He wasn't sure what to say, not with the weight of the night's silence still hanging between them. The morning sun reflected off her face, casting shadows that seemed to exaggerate the tiredness in her eyes. She had been through too much already, more than anyone should have to endure, and yet here she was, still standing. Harlan wasn't sure if he admired her for it, or if he felt pity for her, but neither of those things felt right. He simply didn't know what to make of her. Not yet. He turned away from her then, walking over to the horses to double-check their gear. Anna followed him, her movements slow but deliberate. She didn't speak, but the air between them felt thick, as though something was waiting to be said, waiting to be confronted. It wasn't until they were on the trail, riding side by side, that Harlan spoke again. His voice was low, almost drowned out by the sound of their horses' hooves against the wet earth. "About last night," he began, then trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. Anna didn't look at him, her eyes fixed ahead on the trail as the land unfolded before them. "Don't worry about it," she said quietly. "We all have things we're running from." The words hit Harlan like a cold wind, sharp and unforgiving. She wasn't wrong. They were both running from something, but neither of them had the words to explain what that something was. For Harlan, it was the ghost of his wife, the guilt that still gnawed at him. For Anna, it was her past, the things that had been done to her, the things she had survived. Neither of them had the luxury of asking for help. Neither of them had the luxury of relying on someone else to make the pain go away. They were alone in this, together, but apart. They rode in silence for a while longer, the landscape stretching on before them, endless and unchanging. The clouds had parted, and the sun was beginning to break through, casting patches of light across the land. The trail was narrow, winding between jagged rocks and twisted trees. The sound of their horses' hooves on the soft earth was the only sound that filled the air, a steady rhythm that echoed in the quiet. Eventually, they came to a small clearing, a place where the land opened up and the trail split in two directions. Harlan stopped, his horse's reins tightening in his hands as he surveyed the landscape. Anna rode up beside him, her eyes scanning the trail ahead, though she didn't speak. "We're not far from the old settlement," Harlan said, his voice low. "We can stop there for the night." Anna nodded, though she didn't look at him. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the distant hills, where the land seemed to fall away into nothingness. Harlan didn't push her. He didn't have to. She had made her choice, just like he had made his. They were both moving forward, even if they didn't know where they were headed. He urged his horse forward, and Anna followed suit, her movements slow but steady. As they rode on, the weight of the silence between them began to feel less oppressive. The land around them seemed to open up, the path stretching wide before them, like a road that could lead anywhere. But Harlan knew better. The road was never as simple as it seemed, and no matter how far they went, they would both still be haunted by the past. As they neared the settlement, the weather began to shift again. The wind picked up, howling through the trees as the sky darkened once more, heavy clouds gathering in the distance. The storm wasn't over, and neither was the journey. The wind carried voices ahead, low, sharp, arguing. Anna's hand drifted to her belt knife before Harlan even spoke. "Get ready," he said, as they approached the settlement. Harlan's eyes narrowed when he spotted movement in the distance figures emerging from the edge of the trees, riding toward them. He reached for his rifle instinctively, his heart racing. "Get ready," he muttered under his breath. The world outside the cabin had been silent for too long, and now it felt like it was about to explode, either in violence or in the release of something that had been building between them for days. The quiet that had followed the storm seemed to have settled too deeply, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. Harlan stood at the cabin door, his hand resting on the worn handle, his eyes scanning the horizon. The wind had picked up again, though the storm had passed, leaving behind only the remnants of its fury. The trees outside the cabin swayed gently, their branches creaking in the wind. But the world beyond still felt tense, like the calm before a fight. Anna sat by the fire, her face cast in shadows, the flickering light of the flames dancing across her features. She hadn't said much since the morning. Her silence had become more pronounced, as though the weight of the journey had finally begun to catch up with her. Harlan had noticed it too, how she seemed to withdraw further into herself, like a person closing off from the world, afraid to let anyone in. But he didn't press her. He didn't need to. The moment that had passed between them by the creek still lingered in his mind. She had asked him what he was running from, and he had tried to give her an answer. He wasn't sure it had been the right one, but it was the truth as far as he could tell. He wasn't running. He was just moving forward. But as the days passed, Harlan couldn't help but feel like he was running after something else, something that wasn't just in his past. He had thought he could outrun the ghosts of Devil's Ridge, but the more he tried to distance himself from it, the more it seemed to creep up behind him. And now, with Anna in his life, with the unspoken bond between them, it felt like the ghosts were trying to follow her too. A shadow moved outside the cabin, crossing the small patch of snow that led to the door. Harlan's hand instinctively reached for his rifle, his senses sharpening, alert to the disturbance. He glanced back at Anna, who had already stood, her face tense with the same awareness. "Stay inside," he muttered, his voice low but firm. Anna hesitated, her gaze lingering on him. There was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but it quickly faded, replaced by something more resolute. She didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and stepped back from the fire, her movement steady as she backed into the shadows of the cabin. Out of sight. Harlan opened the door slowly, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. He stepped outside into the cold air, the wind biting at his skin. The figure in the distance was getting closer now, their shape becoming clearer as they neared. Harlan could see the outline of a horse, the rider cloaked against the weather, the horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of snow with each step. Harlan didn't move. His fingers tightened around the rifle as he waited. The muscles in his legs coiled, ready for whatever was coming. As the rider approached, Harlan's grip on the rifle relaxed just slightly. The figure was familiar, too familiar. The silhouette of the man became clearer, and Harlan's chest tightened as the recognition hit him. Sheriff Holt Buchanan. The sheriff had been a fixture in the town of Coyote's Reach, a man who ruled with a steady hand, but one that held a kind of oppressive authority that always seemed to smother the life out of a place. He had been a thorn in Harlan's side for years, and now, here he was, riding straight to the cabin. Harlan didn't say anything. He simply stood there, waiting for Buchanan to make the first move. The sheriff's horse came to a stop just in front of Harlan, the animal's breath fogging in the cold air. Buchanan dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the snow as he straightened up, eyeing Harlan with that same practiced, cold gaze. "Harlan," Buchanan said, his voice gravelly and deep. "Figured I'd find you out here." Harlan didn't answer immediately. He studied the sheriff for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Buchanan had always been a man who thrived on control, who used his badge to force people into submission. But there was something in his eyes now. Something darker. Something that Harlan didn't trust. "What do you want?" Buchanan Harlan's voice was steady, though it carried an edge that cut through the stillness. Buchanan paused for a moment, as if deciding how to respond. The air between them seemed to thicken, the silence stretching longer than it should have. Finally, the sheriff spoke. "You know why I'm here?" Buchanan said, "I've got a warrant for that girl you've got locked up in there." Harlan's stomach tightened at the mention of Anna, the words like a slap to the face. His hand instinctively went to the rifle at his side, though he didn't raise it. He wasn't going to be the one to make the first move. Not yet. "She's not yours to take," Harlan said, his voice colder now, the fire of protection sparking in his chest. "You have no claim on her." Buchanan let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "You think you can protect her? She's a thief." Harlan stole from the Glay Ranch. They want her back, and I've got my orders. Harlan's jaw tightened. He had known this was coming. The town would never let a girl like Anna slip through its fingers. There were too many men with too many eyes watching. Buchanan wasn't here because of justice. He was here because of a deal, a power play between the sheriff and Glay. But Harlan wasn't going to let him take Anna, not without a fight. "You're not taking her," Harlan said again, his hand tightening around the rifle. Buchanan's smile widened, his fingers twitching near his holster. The first shot rang out before either of them moved, stepping forward. His posture was firm, resolute, not without a damn good reason. Buchanan's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Harlan thought he saw a flicker of uncertainty. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze Harlan had come to expect. "I don't need a reason." "Harlan," Buchanan replied, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm the law around here, and you're about to make a big mistake." Before Harlan could respond, Buchanan made a subtle motion with his hand, almost too quick to see. From behind the sheriff, a second rider appeared, emerging from the trees at the edge of the clearing. The man was tall, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Harlan's heart skipped. He didn't need to see the man's face to know who it was. Another one of Buchanan's men. The situation was escalating fast. Harlan's instincts flared, his hand tightening around the rifle as he prepared for whatever was coming next. The sheriff's voice broke through his thoughts, low and steady. "It's not too late to let her go. Harlan, you can walk away from this." Harlan didn't answer. His heart was pounding, his mind working faster than his body could move. He had a choice to make: stay and fight, or walk away. But one thing was clear: there was no walking away from this. Not now. Before Harlan could make a move, the second rider raised his rifle, aiming directly at Harlan. Buchanan's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Buchanan staggered back, his gun slipping from his hand as the echo of the shot faded. Harlan didn't lower his rifle, not yet. The storm outside had passed, but this one was just beginning. In the twilight of the west, where the wind blows harsh and unforgiving through the dry, cracked earth, there are stories that linger long after the campfires have burned low and the horses have been stabled for the night. Stories of men who were born too late and women who were forgotten too soon, drifting like the wildflowers that grow where the sun rarely shines, their roots tangled in the forgotten dirt. It is a land where honor is often buried beneath the weight of regret and time, but where the truth, like a stubborn seed, refuses to die. Sometimes, It takes only one person, one soul, with the courage to stand in the face of a storm, to keep the flame of justice alive when the rest of the world has turned away. The wind whispers of the things that were, of promises made and broken, and of lives lived in the shadow of things left unsaid. The sound of hooves on dry ground, the creak of leather saddles, and the crack of old letters being folded in the dim light of a cabin. These are the echoes of what came before. There are no grand moments, no climactic battles, just the quiet endurance of those who chose to stay, to keep going even when the path was unsure. And in that quiet endurance, there is something beautiful, a raw, imperfect humanity that shines through the dust of the years. There are those who think that justice is a thing that must be loud, that it must come in a blaze of glory. But the truth, like the dawn, is most often soft and slow, creeping across the horizon when no one expects it. And so it was with the forgotten woman who wandered in and out of a world that didn't know her name, yet her presence, though brief, was enough to spark the change that would ripple through the lives of those she touched. She was a quiet force, one that didn't demand recognition, but whose actions, simple and unassuming, could shift the course of a man's life, make him remember what it was like to be whole again, to believe in something pure. Perhaps that was the lesson of it all, that justice, though it may come late, still has the power to heal, that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, the smallest flickers of truth, are enough to remind us who we are beneath the weight of our burdens. Honor may be buried, but it is never truly gone, not if we carry it with us, even in the darkest of times. And if, by chance, you listen to the wind at night, if you feel the ground beneath your boots and hear the soft sound of hooves in the distance, remember this, that the most important truths are often the ones whispered in the stillness, the ones no one else hears, but the ones who choose to listen. They are the truths that remain when everything else fades, and they are the truths that change the course of history. If you still believe in those values, in the power of kindness to save a generation, in the honor that survives even when it seems forgotten, let the wind carry that belief with you. Leave a sign if you believe, a word, a gesture, something to show the world that you, too, remember the old ways, the ways of justice, of mercy, of humanity. And if you feel the pull of the West still stirring in your heart, if you find yourself yearning for more of these stories, stories that rise from the dust, stories that linger in the quiet corners of the night, then follow along. Stay with us, for there are more tales to tell. Western Story Chronicles awaits. Let the stories unfold as the night deepens and the fire burns low. And may you always find the strength to listen to the whispers of the past, for in them lies the soul of the West.